What if what truly guides your life is not what you know, but precisely what you insist on not knowing? What if the thing you most fear revealing was, in reality, the invisible force that determines your choices, your failures, and even the paths you think you have freely taken? The human psyche, since the beginning of time, has been described as an arena of light and shadow. Ancient civilizations already intuited this duality, but it was Carl Gustav Jung who gave it precise psychological contours by naming it shadow, that which remains excluded from the field of consciousness. It is not an absolute evil, as Manichaean myths suggest, but rather a dark reservoir where repressed emotions, unspeakable desires, impulses condemned by morality, weaknesses we have learned to hide accumulate, and even talents and possibilities that do not fit the ideal of who we believe we should be. Throughout life, each of us constructs a social mask, our persona, carefully tailored to meet the demands of our environment. However, every time an authentic part of our inner self is rejected to keep this mask intact, it is cast into the depths of the shadow. The result is a disturbing paradox. The more we seek to control the image of who we are, the more enslaved we become to what we deny. Jung warned clearly, until you become conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. How many of your failures, repetitions, and self-sabotage are less a whim of chance and more the direct consequence of internal forces never recognized? Perhaps you felt this suddenly and uncomfortably, a disproportionate burst of anger, a shameful envy, a sadness for no apparent reason. These moments reveal that the shadow doesn't disappear by being ignored. On the contrary, the more we silence it, the more it finds subterranean ways to manifest itself. The individual who projects excessive self-confidence may, in his shadow, harbor an excruciating fear of inadequacy. What appears morally rigid may hide impulses you cannot admit to yourself. The person who obsessively controls another person may hide a deep despair at being abandoned. What seduces excessively may be silently begging for genuine affection. These contradictions are not exceptions, they are the silent rule of the human condition. And each time we refuse to face them, the shadow grows stronger, transforming us into puppets of an invisible script. The question therefore is not whether we possess a shadow, but to what extent are we willing to recognize it? Because the alternative is to allow it to continue to corrode our relationships, our projects, and even our own sanity under the veil of fate. And herein lies the paradox that guides this reflection. It is not in denial, but in confronting darkness, that the possibility of freedom lies. What we call weakness can, in truth, be the gateway to wholeness. What humiliates us today can tomorrow become a source of self-knowledge and strength. Along this journey, we will follow Jung's thought to understand the nature of the shadow, explore the risks of its denial, observe how it manifests itself in contemporary theater, social media, and performance culture, and finally, see how its integration can pave the way for a more authentic state of existence. But before I continue, I leave you with a question that cannot be answered quickly. Are you ready to look in the eye what you have avoided your entire life? Because once that door opens, there is no going back. To grasp the depth of the shadow concept, it is first necessary to understand Carl Gustav Jung's view of the human psyche. Unlike Freud, who emphasized repressed sexuality as the core of neuroses, Jung expanded the horizon of the unconscious. For him, the mind is not merely a repository of repressed desires, but a living organism, endowed with its own structure, composed of universal archetypes, symbols, and forces that transcend individual biography. Within this vast territory, the shadow occupies a central place. It is, in Jungian terms, the dark side of the personality, consisting of all the aspects that the ego, that is, the conscious identity we cultivate, rejects or refuses to integrate. In other words, everything that doesn't fit with the image we wish to project, everything that threatens our socially acceptable persona, is pushed into this psychic basement. However, care must be taken not to confuse the shadow with evil in the absolute sense. Jung insisted that the shadow contains not only primitive or destructive drives, but also creative potential, sensitivities, and talents that, because they do not conform to the ideal of who we should be, have been relegated to oblivion. A person who has repressed their aggression, for example, may have buried their assertiveness and their ability to assert themselves in the world with it. The shadow, therefore, is ambiguous. it is not only that which shames us, but also that which we could be but have not yet been. It is the territory of unrealized possibilities, alongside wounds never healed. This understanding explains why the shadow cannot simply be eliminated. Contrary to the moral utopias that dream of pure or perfect human beings, the psyche does not tolerate amputations. What is denied returns, and often does so in distorted and dangerous ways. Jung saw this clearly when observing the horrors of the 20th century. The rise of totalitarianism, the masses dominated by hate speech, the genocide committed in the name of ideologies. For him, part of this collective violence was precisely the shadow projected onto a social scale. What individuals refused to admit within themselves, cruelty, greed, the desire for power, was projected onto the other, transformed into an absolute enemy, and then exterminated as if it were external to humanity. On an individual level, the mechanism is identical. When we don't acknowledge our envy, we project the image of someone envious onto others. When we don't accept our aggression, we accuse others of being violent. When we don't acknowledge our desires, we condemn the desires of others. Projection is the shadow's preferred strategy for expressing itself without being recognized. But there's an even more subtle aspect. The shadow doesn't just reveal itself in moments of crisis, but in the everyday fabric of life. It's in the resentment that corrodes a friendship, the wounded pride that prevents an apology, the perfectionism that masks insecurity, the irony used as a defense to avoid showing vulnerability. In all these small gestures, the shadow leaves traces of its presence. You might ask yourself, if the shadow is inevitable, what then is the path? For Jung, the answer lies not in destroying the shadow but in integrating it. He called this process individuation, the journey of becoming a whole human being, capable of sustaining within oneself the tension between light and darkness, consciousness and unconscious, persona and shadow. This integration, however, requires courage. We must admit that we are not only what we would like to be. We must endure the sight of our own contradictions without retreating. We must embrace the fact that we are, at the same time, generous and petty, strong and fragile, rational and irrational. Only from this radical honesty can a more authentic life be born. The shadow, in this sense, is not an obstacle to be overcome but a guide. It points to the places where we grew crooked, to the wounds that shaped our fears, to the talents we silenced. Listening to it is a form of reconciliation with oneself. Denying it, on the contrary, is to condemn oneself to compulsively repeat the same mistakes. Jung said that no one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but rather by making darkness conscious. It's precisely this movement that most of us avoid. We prefer the illusion of purity, control, and an immaculate self-image. However, life insists on showing us, at the most inopportune moments, what we try to hide. The question that arises is inevitable. What aspects of yourself have been relegated to the darkness of the shadow? What desires, feelings, or memories have you never dared to admit, but which, silently, continue to determine your choices? If there's one thing Jungian psychology teaches us, it's that what we reject within ourselves doesn't disappear. It transforms into an autonomous, subterranean force, manifesting itself in ways beyond our control. The shadow doesn't tolerate being ignored. It won't allow itself to be buried indefinitely. When repressed, it returns in disguise, often when we least expect it, and almost always in destructive ways. The dynamic is simple and relentless. Everything the ego refuses to acknowledge is pushed into the unconscious. But from the unconscious, these forces are not extinguished. On the contrary, they acquire greater power precisely because they remain beyond the reach of consciousness. It's like an undercurrent, invisible on the surface, but capable of slowly eroding the foundations. This is why so many people repeat the same mistakes throughout their lives, even though they swear they're doing things differently. Unacknowledged anger turns into chronic resentment, seemingly inexplicable outbursts of rage, and a veiled hostility that poisons relationships. Repressed insecurity can manifest as arrogance, exhibitionism, or a constant need to prove worth. Fear of abandonment can disguise itself as obsessive control over others. An unacknowledged desire often returns as a compulsion or addiction. When we deny the shadow, we wage war against ourselves. We create a theater of virtues, sustained by an exhausting energy of repression. But, inevitably, the mask breaks. And when this happens, we're not just surprised by behaviors we don't recognize as ours. We're taken over by them. Who hasn't said after an outburst, "I don't know what came over me"? It is precisely there that the shadow reveals itself. When we act without understanding, when we become strangers within ourselves. But the effects are not limited to the individual. When a person fails to recognize their own shadow, they tend to project it onto others. Thus, what we don't accept in ourselves becomes what we most condemn in others. It's the moralist who obsessively denounces the sins of others, without realizing that they are actually combating their own secret temptation. It's the individual obsessed with the corruption of others, unaware of the small acts of dishonesty they commit daily. It's the one who accuses others of weakness, but trembles at the possibility of being perceived as fragile. This projection mechanism, described by Jung, explains not only personal conflicts but also large-scale social phenomena. Entire peoples have transformed their collective shadows into external enemies. This is how ideologies of hate found fertile ground, by projecting onto the other the evil that refused to be recognized within each individual. The history of the 20th century is a grim testament to how the refusal to deal with one's own unconscious can turn into a collective catastrophe. Denying the shadow therefore does not make us more virtuous, only more dangerous. The individual who fails to acknowledge their aggression does not become peaceful, but passive-aggressive, unable to perceive when their silent hostility corrodes the most intimate bonds. Those who do not admit their vulnerability do not become strong, but rigid, incapable of asking for help and therefore, doomed to collapse alone. The person who refuses to face their envy does not become generous, but a prisoner of a bitterness that poisons any achievements of others. The shadow, when ignored, creates patterns of self-sabotage. It infiltrates poor choices, toxic relationships, and compulsive behaviors. It makes us repeatedly seek out what destroys us, as if there were a strange fidelity to suffering. And indeed there is. Until we recognize what lies beneath, we will repeat the same fate under different guises. But there is an even deeper danger. Denying the shadow impoverishes our humanity. By rejecting the dark side, we also deny the complexity that makes us truly human. We become caricatures of ourselves, reduced to an artificial persona that may be impressive on the outside but is empty on the inside. As Jung wrote, "No man can reach paradise without first having visited his hell." This refusal not only weakens us psychologically but alienates us existentially. Because living under the tyranny of the persona, this mask of selected virtues, is living disconnected from the truth of who we are. It's like living in a house of mirrors. Each reflection returns an image that doesn't entirely correspond to reality. And yet, we insist on defending it as if it were the only possibility. The question then arises, to what extent in your life have you been a slave to an image constructed to avoid confronting your shadow? How many decisions have you made not because they were your most authentic selves, but because they serve to sustain the mask that shields you from the gaze of others? This is the shadow's most subtle trap. By denying it, we sacrifice the possibility of authenticity. We become prisoners of an ideal of impossible perfection and, in the process, lose touch with life in its entirety. The continuous repression of what is uncomfortable results in neuroses, identity crises, and even physical illness. There is no repression without a cost. To deny the shadow is ultimately to deny oneself. It is to reject wholeness in the name of an artificial partiality. And anyone who lives only half-heartedly inevitably feels life as empty, centerless, meaningless. If in the individual the shadow manifests as what has been repressed and forgotten, in the modern world it finds the ideal terrain to be amplified and distorted. We live in an era where inner life has been replaced by constant exposure. We've never had so many tools to present an idealized version of ourselves, and we've never been so vulnerable to the emptiness of not recognizing ourselves in what we show. Social media is perhaps the most emblematic example. It has transformed the old persona, that mask Jung described as the social identity we present to the world, into a ceaseless spectacle. The persona is no longer just a role we play in certain contexts but has become a permanent avatar. A showcase of carefully edited virtues. The perfect body, the productive routine, the right opinions, the unwavering happiness. But like any mask, what it conceals doesn't disappear. On the contrary, with each polished image, the shadow grows in the subterranean psyche. Unconfessed hatred emerges in anonymous comments. Unacknowledged envy appears in silent comparisons that erode self-esteem. Fragility that finds no space transforms into chronic anxiety. The more culture demands positivity, the more individuals are swallowed by an inner darkness they dare not speak of. The contemporary cult of productivity is another symptom of the shadow's repression. Living under the tyranny of constant performance means denying limits, fatigue, and vulnerability. The body becomes a machine to be exploited until collapse. But what is denied returns. In the depression that paralyzes, in the burnout that nullifies any capacity to create, in the feeling that life has become a sequence of soulless tasks. Consumer society, in turn, offers an illusory promise of redemption. The void born of the repressed shadow is filled with objects, experiences, and incessant stimuli. We buy not because we need them but because we want to numb the absence of meaning. With each acquisition, we believe we are approaching a more complete version of ourselves. However, the emptiness soon returns and with it the need for more. This spiral of consumption is nothing more than the shadow converted into a market. Even the culture of modern spirituality, in many of its aspects, has become complicit in the repression of the shadow. The pursuit of constant good vibes, the refusal to deal with negative emotions, the belief that positive thinking solves everything, all of these perpetuate the illusion that the shadow can be abolished. But by denying pain, anger, fear, and contradiction, such practices only deepen the rift between who we are and who we pretend to be. It's curious to note that authenticity has never been so talked about, and we've never been so far from it. The contemporary imperative is to be true, original, unique, but always within the acceptable limits of social spectacle. Authenticity has become yet another performance. And the price of this performance is high. The more we act, the more we disconnect from who we truly are. This disconnection is reflected in a silent epidemic: anxiety, depression, chronic loneliness. Millions of people feel their lives lack substance, as if they are living roles they didn't choose but can't break free from. This feeling is no accident. It's a direct symptom of a culture that idolizes the persona and condemns the shadow to exile. We therefore live in a collective paradox. On one side, a society that demands constant perfection and positivity. On the other, individuals who carry within themselves the weight of an increasingly dense shadow. The result is an existential dissonance. On the outside, smiles, productivity, and digital filters. On the inside, exhaustion, resentment, and fear. This is where Jung's thinking becomes so relevant, because he reminds us that no society can flourish if the individuals who comprise it live at war with their own interiority. The price of repressing the shadow is not just individual, it is collective. A culture that denies the darkness of its members will inevitably be haunted by it in violent forms. Polarization, intolerance, hate speech. If we want to understand contemporary anguish, it's not enough to look at algorithms or economic systems. We need to look at what each of us contributes to this scenario: the refusal to accept our own imperfection, the constant avoidance of what bothers us, the neurotic attachment to a persona that doesn't represent us. The question then becomes inevitable: how many of your current anxieties are, in fact, manifestations of your stifled shadow? How many of the pains you attribute to the outside world are, in essence, reflections of what you have refused to face within yourself? If denying the shadow leads us to illness, integrating this dark territory is the only way to rediscover a whole life. Jung asserted that there is no possible individuation, that is, no full realization of the self, without confronting what causes us shame, fear, or repulsion. What you avoid looking at within yourself is precisely what silently determines the course of your existence. But what does integrating the shadow mean in practice? It's not about annihilating or purifying it. Nor does it mean giving free rein to all your most primitive instincts, as if it were an invitation to chaos. Integration is to recognize, to assume and welcome what exists within us, without masks, without subterfuge, without the illusion of purity. It is taking out of hiding what inhabits us, bringing it to consciousness. Imagine, for example, anger. Many people repress it, believing that being a good person means never getting angry, never speaking out. The result is that this anger turns against itself, corroding mental health, or explodes uncontrollably in moments of rupture. Integrating anger doesn't mean transforming it into violence, but understanding its origins, giving it a voice, converting it into a creative force. The same force that drives change, builds healthy boundaries, and breaks down injustices. The same goes for envy, vanity, and fear. When denied, they become monsters that rule us from the shadows. When acknowledged, they transform into messengers, revealing our weaknesses, hidden desires, and untapped potential. The shadow then ceases to be an enemy and becomes a master. Of course, this process requires courage, because looking at one's own darkness is always painful. It means confronting the fact that we are not as virtuous as we would like, nor as coherent as we preach. It means accepting that within us lies both the saint and the criminal, both the altruist and the selfish. Human beings are, by definition, contradictory. To deny this contradiction is to deny the human condition itself. And yet, it is precisely from this contradiction that freedom is born. Because, by accepting our ambivalence, we cease to be hostages to the image we try to maintain before the world. We no longer need to play the role of perfection. We no longer need to hide our flaws as if they were crimes. We are whole. We are paradoxical. We are human. Jung said that life's task is not to become perfect, but to become whole. Perfection is an illusion, a mask that suffocates. Wholeness, in turn, is reconciliation with the plurality that inhabits us. When we integrate the shadow, we discover that our wounds also hide our power, that our fears hold the key to our courage, that our darkest instincts carry the energy necessary to create, love, and transform. But how to start this process? It begins with a simple yet profoundly challenging act: honesty. Asking yourself, what in myself do I not want to admit? What aspects of my life do I hide even from myself? How do I project onto others what I cannot tolerate in myself? These questions don't seek immediate answers but rather openness. Because each glimpse of awareness is already a step on the path to integration. And this path is solitary but not necessarily isolated. Therapy, analysis, deep reflection practices, all of these can serve as mirrors that help us see what we deny. But no technique replaces the inner willingness to confront oneself. There are no shortcuts. There are no ready-made formulas. There is only the hard, patient, and ultimately liberating work of embracing one's own abyss. The curious thing is that, by integrating the shadow, we don't become darker, we become brighter. Because the light that doesn't recognize the night is artificial, superficial, incapable of withstanding the slightest storm. Only the light that has passed through the darkness possesses density, consistency, and truth. It is this light that transforms, not the sterile luminosity of toxic positivity. And here we arrive at an essential turning point. Embracing the shadow is not just an individual movement, but also an ethical act. Because the individual who embraces their own darkness stops projecting it onto others. They no longer need scapegoats, imaginary enemies, or simplistic narratives of good versus evil. By accepting themselves as human, they also accept the humanity of others, with their imperfections and ambiguities. Perhaps this is the true revolution our time needs: fewer people pretending to be pure and more people willing to acknowledge their complexity. Because it is only from this recognition that the possibility of authentic relationships, less violent societies, and lives more rooted in reality emerge. The question remains: are you willing to look at what's inside you when the lights go out? Are you ready to face the mirror that doesn't beautify but reveals? Are you prepared to discover that what you've feared so much may actually be the key to your freedom? We have reached the point where everything comes together. The shadow we try to deny, the fear we avoid, the contradiction that tears us apart. All of this, when acknowledged, reveals the central paradox of existence. Only when we embrace our chains do we discover what it means to be free. Freedom, in the profound sense that Jung invites us to consider, is not the absence of limits, but reconciliation with them. It's not doing whatever you want, but being whole in who you are. Because the greatest prison is not external circumstances, nor social norms, nor the obstacles of fate. The greatest prison is self-ignorance, living as a slave to impulses we pretend not to have, to wounds we don't acknowledge, to desires we project onto others. Refusing to look at the shadow doesn't free us, it chains us. The courage to confront it, paradoxically, returns us to the world with more lightness. Because we no longer need to waste energy maintaining the mask of perfection. We no longer need to fear the revelation of our flaws. We no longer need to run from ourselves. Ask yourself, what's heavier, continuing to play an unreal character, or carrying the imperfect truth of who you are? Perhaps you'll find that the burden of authenticity, though arduous, is infinitely more bearable than the burden of inner lies. The integration of the shadow leads us to a mature freedom, not the naive freedom of those who believe themselves to be above the human condition, but the lucid freedom of those who know that within themselves there is both light and darkness, and that the two are inseparable. At this point, human beings discover something essential. It is not possible to eliminate evil, but it is possible to transform its energy. It is not possible to silence instincts, but it is possible to give them a conscious voice. It is not possible to erase the night, but it is possible to learn to walk under the stars. And in this journey, a new way of inhabiting the world emerges. More humble, more compassionate, more truthful. Because by recognizing one's own shadow, one also recognizes the shadow of others, and understands that no one is entirely vile or entirely holy. We are all walking paradoxes, all bearers of light and darkness, all unfinished fragments in search of wholeness. Ultimately, integrating the shadow means accepting life in its entirety, without convenient edits, without illusions of purity, without promises of perfection. It means looking within and saying, I am this too, and in that recognition finding peace. Jung might have smiled to see that the freedom he so longs for lies not in the removal of our darkness, but in its assimilation. For only when we accept being human in all its complexity do we truly become whole. And you? Are you willing to let go of the illusion of perfection to embrace the truth of your wholeness? Are you ready to carry within you not only the light but also the night? Are you ready to discover that your shadow, far from destroying your life, can be the deepest source of your freedom? If this reflection touched something within you, if for a moment you felt that part of your shadow needed to be acknowledged, subscribe to the channel. Here we will continue to explore the paradoxes that make us human, and you won't have to walk this journey of self-discovery alone.